The name Leo Murphy mightn't mean much to you. He was born on these premises here in August of 1901. It was a pub back then as it is now. His mother, Kate, was the publican here and a busy mother of 5 children into the bargain. And as if she didn't have enough on her plate, she taught in the local school and played harmonium in the local church. Of the 5 children, Leo was in the middle, with Dermot and Mamie above him, and below him Rose, and then Frank, the baby of the family. The father, Walter, was a stonemason and a small-time builder, but he had died a few years after Frank was born. I think Leo might have been about 12 at the time. I suspect that they all inherited their mother's staunch Republican views and strong Catholic faith. The White Horse. I'll tell you how this pub got its name. They say that when Leo Murphy used to visit here, regardless of how he came, he would always leave on a white horse that would be left for him the field up behind the pub. Now, I'm sure the reality is that there were many different kinds of horses used, and even a white horse isn't that white, unless somebody undertakes to wash him every day. But there's something about that image of the white horse that seems to embody the spirit of this extraordinary young man who, rightly or wrongly, gave his young life for a cause from which many of us now benefit. Everybody in Ballincollig knows the wall that used to run the full length of the village. You can still see a bit of it out there. I'd say the Murphy family probably worked on that wall, given that the father, Walter, and all before him were in the masoning trade. Where there's a wall, there's a story. And that wall played its part in the drama that befell Leo Murphy and his family during the War of Independence. Today, the wall is a benign part of a transformed local architecture with businesses and housing and fancy shops, that sort of thing in behind it. Not to mention the beautiful regional park. 100 years ago, there were 3 great symbols of British rule in behind that wall. The gunpowder mills, the British military barracks, and the RIC barracks, which was just across the way here. The wall. It was taken for granted by generations living here in the village and in the surrounding country area. Employment for generations in the gunpowder mills, the military barracks providing a demand for goods and services, and the police force, a bunch of farmers' sons for the most part, happy to have the little bit of steady income, sending a few bob home maybe. Very little for them to do by way of imposing the letter of the law and solving crime. But there was a turn, a change. In the 5 years after the Easter Rising between 1916 and 1921, it's as if that wall became higher and more guarded for those on the inside, and more imposing and sinister for those on the outside. The peaceful coexistence had come to an end. What makes a young man decide to go to war? He might be under the illusion that it's some sort of a playground game, oblivious to the nightmares that await him. At the age of 15, Leo Murphy went to work as a draper's assistant in Nolan's of North Main Street in Cork City, a counter hopper as they were playfully called. It was here that he met Florence O'Donoghue, a Kerry man, Now, it's relevant that all of this was happening just a few months after the Easter Rising, and I have no doubt that the conversation between the two young men was lively on all matters political. And so together they decided to join the IRA early in 1917 at the Volunteer Hall in Cork City. Leo quickly rose through the ranks, and by the time he was 16 years of age, he was out here in Sri Lanka training volunteers. Soon he was the head of the company, which was like the hit squad in the locality for the IRA. By the time the War of Independence started, he was well known to the British military and seen as a real thorn in the side of the Crown. In July of 1920, the British, as part of an initiative to quell the rebellion, sent the Manchester Regiment of the Army to the barracks here in Ballincollig. Leo Murphy would have been around 18 years of age at the time. In the regiment you had a Captain Joseph Thompson, a Belfast man and ex-teacher, decorated hero of the First World War. He was made intelligence officer and soon became a figure of hatred here in the village. He would go into the local shops brandishing his revolver and threatening that if anything happened to him, the whole village would go up. His very words. It was a credible threat. Many towns and villages around the country had been torched at that point. For Thompson, Leo Murphy was the big prize. He would have done anything to get his hands on him and did not draw the line at intimidating the members of Leo's family. One night, in a drunken rage, he raided the Murphy household, this building here, and threatened the family members for information regarding Leo's whereabouts. He roughed up Leo's beloved sister Rose, who at that time was dying of tuberculosis. He left the place in a mess, but with no information. Can you imagine Leo Murphy's outrage on hearing that story? On November the 20th, Captain Joseph Thompson left the barracks on his army-issue motorcycle and was found 2 days later in a turnip field outside of Bishopstown. He was blindfolded and he had 2 bullet wounds to the head. He had been on his way home when he found a cart blocking the road. He was ambushed, kidnapped, and executed by 3 IRA volunteers. There was no doubt in anybody's mind in behind the wall here that Leo Murphy had fired the fatal shots. There may have been some virtue in leaving Thompson alive to keep on doing the bad job he was already doing so well. It is easy to be wise in hindsight, as they say. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. He would be replaced by a Lieutenant Frank Egbert Vining, a young career soldier, only a few years older than Leo Murphy himself, who had already made a big impression with his superiors. A completely different kettle of fish. There was a new sheriff in town. The Manchesters had a song, Ballincollig. It is a most beautiful spot. It is killing me fast and will soon kill the lot. There's nothing but raindrops from far and from near, and it gets in the milk and it gets in the beer. We have rabbits for ferreting, we're out every day, but so far the rabbits have kept right away. I suspect that as far as the British were concerned, Leo Murphy was rabbit in chief. The RIC had always been a benign part of the local community, but after the Rising and during the War of Independence, they were fair game. Sergeant Henry Bloxham was stationed in the RIC barracks across the road here. He was cycling up to Waterfall with Head Constable Larkin to investigate a raid on a train when they were ambushed by Leo Murphy and others. Bloxham died on the scene. After Bloxham's funeral outside at Carrigrohan, the RIC rampaged through the town, marking houses for burning with red paint. The ironic thing was that it was all houses of pro-Britishers, as they were called, that they marked, even though there was plenty of volunteers living in the village. I suppose it's hard to organise such a thing when you're in a state of heartbroken rage. In any case, there was no houses burnt. After that, Leo Murphy had no choice but to make himself very scarce. Wouldn't you wonder what being in the run was like? It must have been misery, going from house to house, never spending too long in any one place, sleeping in sheds and barns and farm buildings when you could sleep, constantly on the alert for the next raid by the enemy, terrified all the time, longing for the comforts of home. And there might be a few young fellas sharing the same house, and the food supplies for the week would all be gone in one meal. Scant supplies then for the rest of the week for that household. That's how Leo Murphy lived for a lot of this time, never knowing who to trust. It wasn't a given that everybody in the community supported the IRA. Many of them saw them as louts and villains and murderers, with Leo Murphy the villain in chief. Vining was determined to get him. While Leo was on the run, his beloved sister Rose died of the tuberculosis that had dogged her life for many years. He could not be with her in her final hours. The best he could do was watch her burial in the family plot outside in Kilcray Abbey at a distance. He watched from a hiding place high above the burial ground. If he were to appear in public, he could be arrested or worse. Such were the times. We may, according to our own prejudices and perspectives, our own analysis, allocate the roles of hero and villain in an arbitrary way. It is easy enough for death to become a common currency. Earlier in June of 1921, 3 young bandsmen attached to the Manchesters were executed out in ovens by the IRA. 3 teenage boys, 3 young musicians slaughtered by teenage boys, who would in turn themselves be slaughtered. What kind of human distortion gives rise to such horror? They, like their Irish counterparts, had mothers, fathers, family, friends, lovers, hopes. Leo was at a battalion meeting in O'Donovan's public house out in Waterfall when the pub was surrounded by a unit of the British Army under Vining and Major Evans. The pub was packed at the time. There had been a sporting event in the area that day. It was a beautiful summer's evening. The IRA would often hold their meetings under cover of such social activity, but I have no doubt that Leo enjoyed the ambience as any young man of his age would. There must have been a tip-off. The commotion was heard outside. Very soon it became clear that there was no way out. The pub went silent. Leo went out, as they say, all guns blazing, and was shot dead while trying to escape over a ditch. I find it interesting that the only memento we have of him is a razor kit that was taken from his body after he was shot dead by the British Army on June the 27th, 1921. He can't have been shaving that long. The razor is now in a museum in Manchester. The next day, his mother Kate, who had buried her daughter Rose only a few weeks earlier, was called to identify the dead body of her young son. She walked, accompanied by a soldier of the army who had killed him, to look upon his ashen, bloodless face, to say his name, to acknowledge that she was indeed his mother, he her son. A truce was called 2 weeks later. All we can do now is remember him and perhaps entertain the notion that for all the drama he encountered in his young life, he might have lived on for better pastures. It was not to be.